Hey there, it's Rachel Mullins, the host of Hashtag No Filter Fridays on Public House Media.
Strike three, you're out.
Welcome back to another edition of Caught Listening, the baseball show that goes beyond the white lines. Christian Heimel here with you, broadcasting as we do every single week, part of the Public House Media Network. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram. You can also find us on Facebook. Just search Caught Listening by Public House Media. You can get the show wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Google Play, of course, Amazon Podcasts now, as well as publichousemedia.org. As we head into the final weeks of 2020, again, it's been a very rough year for a lot of folks, and the baseball world has lost some true legends. Joe Morgan, Lou Brock, Tom Seaver. Of course, you've had so many others. Charlie Pride most recently, who, to be honest, folks, as a country music fan, I knew Charlie, but I didn't even realize his gravitas in baseball in the Negro Leagues as well. But we're excited to talk about his legacy as well as we continue our In Memoriam series.
Him, and we'll be glad to talk about him.
Well, let's start there, because I mean, have you on and our guest as another. Every time we have someone on more than once, I like to consider them a friend of the show. So I hope he does the same. Longtime New York Times sports columnist Mr. George Vescey is joining us here today, sir. One of the more recent passings is Charlie Pride, and again, I knew him as a country music fan, but I did not know until after his passing his impact in the world of baseball as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, he played in the Negro Leagues, and like a lot of guys, he tried to make the switch over. I believe he was in the Los Angeles or California Angels training camp. He had some tryout in '61 and didn't make it, or didn't want to work out in the minor leagues. It was majors or nothing. But he certainly had the credentials as a ball player.
Tremendous. Yeah, as you learn that, and that's one of the wonderful things. I hate to say wonderful things about someone's passing, but you do learn so much more about them, and you do really appreciate the life that they led after they are gone. And two gentlemen who, for New York Yankee fans, they lost this year. They certainly have appreciated quite a bit. That's Don Larsen and Whitey Ford. Don passing away first of the year in 2020, and then Whitey Ford earlier, a little bit later on in the year. But you've covered the Yankees for quite some time. Don, obviously, the tremendous perfect game in the World Series. Whitey, known as the chairman of the board. For those two gentlemen who were teammates for a number of years with the Yankees, what kind of legacy did they leave behind in Pinstripes?
I think their legacy is entirely separate. I mean, in fact, they were teammates for a while. I mean, all Yankees become, they take on the aura, or they contribute to the aura. In Larsen's case, he did both, and obviously Whitey did. And it really is a great bond. Anybody who was with the Yankees at the same time has been the great franchise, any way you look at it, from the 20s, for 100 years. It's been the great franchise. And I'm not a Yankee fan, but sure, they were certainly bonded by having been teammates, and in some big years and big World Series together.
Don Larsen is one of those ones who people look at and they go, he had the perfect game in the World Series, and you almost wonder what else would he have had in his career without that. But what kind of pitcher was he? Because I mean, again, you look at some of his numbers, and yes, he had a couple of 20 lost seasons at one point, but you throw a perfect game in the World Series, it's not a fluke.
It's not a fluke because you're good enough to do it for 9 innings that day. But did it make the rest of his career appreciably better? Really not. You say to yourself, if he on that day was able to do that, everything came together, as it has for other pitchers who had that one game, the no-hitter, the perfect game, or, a lot of strikeouts. And I mean, I saw a guy named Grover Powell pitch a 1-0 shutout for the Mets against the Phillies, and I guess it was 62 or 63 for sure. And Casey Stengel was making, but he never did anything else, and he was gone out of the major leagues within a year, and all of that. So you look and say, boy, Grover Powell, he can't miss. He's going to be the Mets' first great young pitcher. But nothing ever happened. If Don Larsen had done that earlier in a career, you might have had more hope for him. But while I really can't speak to being up close to him. I never met him that I know about. I wrote about him only for from a distance. But it seems to me that he had the reputation all along as an underachiever. I mean, true, he came up with the awful St. Louis Browns, had a year in Baltimore, and then was traded in that huge trade between the Baltimore Orioles and the Yankees. I mean, whatever, 15, 18 players, whatever it was, back and forth. And he immediately became a 500 pitcher or better, culminating in that perfect game in 1956. So clearly he would have been better if he'd come up with a better team. Maybe he got into bad habits. From everything I know about him, and this is not, speaking badly of the departed, but it sounds like he was somewhat of a night owl and a character, and he drank and drove his car late at night and all of that. Probably as part of his pattern, and it kept him from being better than he was. He certainly wasn't a disciplined athlete the way so many mediocre players are. They get themselves where they do because they're disciplined.
We're talking with George Vescey, longtime New York Times sports columnist. The passing of Don Larsen and Whitey Ford in 2020. It's interesting. I want to bring this up about Don because it's kind of a little bit of a sidebar. But so many players, and we talk about this, especially in the era in the 40s and in the 50s, whose baseball career was put on hold or maybe even never allowed to jumpstart because of military conflict. Don was one of those ones who was in the minor league system and then went and served in the Korean War for a couple of years. The difference of what a baseball player was at that time as opposed to now, where guys are finding day jobs. Guys are, obviously the draft era is no more, and that wouldn't happen, but just a completely different life that baseball players lived in that time.
No, absolutely. I mean, I knew players, both basketball and baseball players, in the 40s and into the 50s, who would stop playing to make a better life. I mean, first of all, a more stable life at home, but also if they used their degree and got a teaching job or whatever it was, that they could live better from being a civilian than from being a ball player. And obviously that changed and rapidly. I didn't believe the salaries that were being paid to players. I was out of sports for 10 years, and when I left in 70 to when I came back in 80, people would be talking about seven figures, and I said, no, that can't be right. It's publicity, but no, in fact, it had changed. But I don't know if any of that had to do with Larsen. I mean, he was a playboy runaround, and that just was his. Nobody's denying it. Nobody said the guy went home was in his room at 11 o'clock and reading a good book. So maybe a lot of his potential was wasted that way also. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, you can't take away the time that ball players spent in the military. Right. Don Newcomb came up with the Dodgers and almost immediately had to spend 2 years in the military, came back and was still a great pitcher for years after that. But Nuke did 2 years in the military.
Yep. I mean, Ted Williams, arguably the greatest hitter, lost two of his best years in his prime as a fighter pilot.
Exactly. And then went back in for Korea.
Yeah.
So I mean, there's no doubt in Williams' case.
It's
in
really
numbers. Maybe he could never have been a better ball player than he was, in my opinion. But he certainly could have. He could have had, instead of 521 home runs. You start to add it up. They lost those years.
100%. I want to get to Whitey because he's one of these guys who, you don't get a nickname the chairman of the board for no reason. No. And it's one thing to put on the pinstripes as a ball player. It's another thing to do it as a New York City native, born and bred, like Whitey Ford was. Talk about him as a player, as a man, as an ambassador for the New York Yankees.
Well, first of all, as a kid from Queens myself, a little bit different part of Queens, but nevertheless, I like to think that we in Queens are all point guards and quick on our feet, and we all see out of both out corners of our eyes, know what's going on. Whitey was so street smart. He was so quick that he could handle everything about the business. There was nothing. I mean, did he have a nightlife? Did he run around with Mickey and Billy Martin and stuff like that? The habits that he might have had, yeah, probably. But nevertheless, this was a guy that knew how to take care of himself in the baseball sense of the word, and he also nothing fazed him. Casey, he could handle. Casey loved him when Casey didn't start him a game or put him back or didn't use him the way. Whitey understood it. He fumed about it maybe, but he understood that he was part of that team and that Casey was. He could handle anything. He didn't let it get to him. So he was a really cool guy. And the press, there was not a ball player in that whole time. I knew other guys who were really good guys like Bobby Brown and Tommy Henrik, but there was nobody like Whitey. For if he'd have a bad game, you'd go to him. The reporters would go to him and he'd say, "Hey, I stunk up today," and using more pungent words than that. I was terrible. I didn't have it. I made a mistake. I shouldn't have thrown that pitch. He knew that there was no point in sugarcoating when he had a bad day, because he certainly had enough of them. But he was not a front runner about himself either. He was just easy to talk to. And I had a particular break, and I think my friend Steve Jacobson, who's really one of my closest friends in the business, when Steve and I were coming along together in the early '60s, Whitey's point was, "Hey, you're a Newsday guy," which is where I worked for like 8 years. And Whitey's point was, "Hey, come to me. I'll help you out. I'll help you out. How many ball players say I'll help you out?" And a couple of times he helped me out, even if I want to talk to Mantle about something. He'd go up to Mantle and say, "Slick, the guy wants to talk to you for 15 minutes. Just sit there." And Mantle would come over and be as nice as could be, because Whitey had put the stamp on me, at least for that day.
An incredible person, too. And what's amazing is you look at his numbers, even today, and I was reading this earlier, but his career ERA, I believe, is third best still in Major League history.
Right.
Only Clayton Kershaw and Jacob deGrom are better, which is just incredible for someone who pitched 50 years ago to still be there.
Yeah, and when he pitched, now Casey did, maybe because of his size, the left-handed thing, he'd keep him out of, a Fenway Park a little bit because of so many right-handed hitters would be in the game that day. But you didn't coddle Whitey, and in those days you didn't coddle any pitcher. It was hoped that any starting pitcher could go 9 innings that day. And you look at how many pitchers would go 9 and lose the game. They were a run or two behind and they'd lose, but it was their game. And that was the way it was played. And for Whitey, not the biggest man, but he was so smart that he could just play in that format.
Talking with George Vescey, longtime New York Times sports columnist, here about the passing of Yankee legends Don Larsen and Whitey Ford. Whitey, again, born and raised in New York City, putting on those pinstripes. But then what I love about the game of baseball, maybe more so than any other sport, is how connected certain legends stay to the team that they were with. I mean, Cal Ripken and his involvement with the Orioles now, but Whitey and the way he hung around, the way he stayed involved with the Yankees over the course of his post-playing career, I mean, just a tremendous, show of how much he loved not only the sport but that organization.
Well, it pays off. I don't know whether he could have done anything with any other club. I don't think he wanted to. He was a pitching coach for a couple of years toward the end of his career for I can't remember, for Houck, for Yogi, for Johnny Keane. But it was pretty clear to, I guess, to him, and probably to me, if I'd ever thought about it that way, that he wasn't really suited. He came from a different time. I don't think he wanted to go through the travel. If Mickey wasn't there and Billy wasn't there, and the conditions were different, did he want to be an example and a mentor to 10, 12, 15 pitchers coming through that season? I don't think he did. I mean, life was easier for him to do what he did, to get endorsements, to appear in Bud Light commercials, all the things he did. Life was easier for him, and I don't think he wanted to work hard at being a baseball lifer.
You mentioned there was at one point, and doing some research before this, you had written an article in 2015 after the passing of Yogi Berra that called Whitey Ford the greatest living Yankee after Yogi's passing. So I want to ask you now, if you were writing a similar article after the passing of Whitey Ford, who would you put up on that list as the greatest living Yankee?
Well, the way that story came about, that column came about, is that the Times had a great baseball editor, a guy named Jay Schreiber.
Mm-hmm.
Baseball was his primary responsibility. And Jay called me. I'd already retired, but it was fun that I'd get a call from Jay once in a while, and he'd say, "Hey, you know all about this more than the young guys we have working today, blah, blah, blah. Who do you think is the – because I think it's Whitey Ford. Now that Yogi's gone, I think – what do you think?" Well, Jay knew better than I did, and I wound up writing that column. I remember trying to call Whitey to get his thoughts on it, and I believe I got to his – she didn't identify herself, but I'm pretty sure it was Joan Ford. And she said, "Oh, he's not available. He's out to lunch." Well, he may have out to lunch. I don't know how that was meant in the long run, because I do know that he was not doing well the last X years of his life. But I didn't talk to him. I would have liked to, because he was a very modest person. I mean, one of the other things was he really didn't need to have people fussing over him. So he might have said, there's so many people. He said, what about the guys who play every day? Don Mattingly, Bernie Williams. And he probably would have gotten around to Jeter and to Mariano Rivera. Since Whitey's not here to pass the baton to somebody else, I'll think for him and say, I would say that the greatest living Yankee now is Mariano Rivera, and I say that with great respect for Don Mattingly and for Derek Jeter. Great players. Jeter, Hall of Fame. Mattingly probably should be if he hadn't certainly would be if he hadn't gotten hurt. But nevertheless, I would say Rivera, because he was the best relief pitcher I ever saw, and you have to go by the records. He was a different kind of greatness, to be honest.
As someone who grew up rooting for every fiber of Mariano Rivera's cutter to never work in his life, I think I would have to agree with you. Not to mention, again, Whitey had a record of consecutive scoreless innings in the World Series, and I believe Mo broke that at one point. So that's certainly it's an organization that doesn't have that is at a loss for great people to pass that baton to. But Mo Rivera is certainly up there.
Yeah, they had bad years. I mean, the organization had fallen apart, and it really wasn't doing well until those guys came along. The reason they came along, and you know this story as well as I do, is that Steinbrenner was suspended one year for vile behavior and political skullduggery. And while he was gone, he wasn't supposed to have any impact on the team. He wanted to get rid of all these kids and bring in some real stars. And Gene Michael, who was the general manager, and had total approval by Major League Baseball. George couldn't call the shots. Stick was a very stubborn, strong-minded guy, and he said, "No, this is the core of the team. For once, we're gonna." I don't know that he said for once, but let's keep this core of the team. Those core four, and then Bernie a year or two before, and they did, and that's why. And of course, George acknowledged that. He understood that the team had been really well monitored. The stewardship of Stick Michael was terrific, and that's how George looked so smart.
It's one of those things that, and I can't. We should do a whole nother conversation about that, because it's one of the biggest what ifs, in my opinion, in baseball, and that's what if George Steinbrenner hadn't been suspended and he actually traded Derek Jeter like he really, really wanted to, and a bunch of those young kids. What would have happened to not only the core four as individuals, but to that organization, the Yankees? I want to ask you this, too, because this was a year, again, anytime a legend passes, you generally have an opportunity for the fans, the organization to say a final farewell, all the pomp and circumstance at a ball game. And that didn't happen this year, obviously, with COVID. So, Lord willing, and we're back to relative normalcy in 2021, and fans are allowed to be back at the ballpark. What do you think is going to be, I don't want to say done for, or what do you think, how will the Yankees remember these two gentlemen, in Don Larsen and Whitey Ford, when they can have the fans back in Yankee Stadium?
I don't have any doubt that the Yankees are well run. Cashman and the people, the business end of it, they'll know how to do it. I leave it totally up to them. The Yankee, it's in the DNA of Yankee management and Yankee fans, is that the echoes when in the good old stadium or this one now, which feels like a theme park, nevertheless the echoes, the rumbling, I was there when Babe Ruth made a farewell at the end of the 1940s. First time I was ever in Yankee Stadium, my dad took me up last game of the season, and there Babe Ruth dying, looking in his outsized Yankee uniform, number 3, and he was making a talk. That's what the Yankees have, that in their blood. Dying people, dead people, and I don't mean that disrespectfully, but they have had so many stars, some of whom died young, and it never failed that they would find the right way, just like the Red Sox have done for Ted Williams and making up for some of their sins against not hiring black ball players. Yep. The Red Sox have gotten to, let's touch the core, the fundamental core of the fan and the right thing to do, and the Yankees will find a way. So far be it from me to tell them how to do it.
Well, you bring up something that just popped into my head, too, is, with Whitey, because I believe 17 years, and I believe all of them with the New York Yankees, and that doesn't happen, obviously, in today's free agent world. The last person, in my opinion, who, from a retirement standpoint, who, is there, maybe we get lucky with Mike Trout, and he stays with the Angels his entire career, and hopefully, for the sake of baseball, he wins a couple World Series there. But Derek Jeter might have been the last player, in my opinion, to play his entire career with one team and reach that kind of status that a Whitey Ford maybe had.
Could be. You mean as a regular player? Well, of course, Mo stayed with them the whole time. Also, maybe I'm not coming up with anybody as an example, but you have to really love the place you are. Is it really worth how many millions more is it worth? Or do you do it to go for the ring, to be in a World Series, to have a better chance at it? If Ernie Banks could have gone and played somewhere else, he certainly was on good teams that didn't win. I think that's up to every individual ball player.
100%. And we really do appreciate your time, George Vescey, longtime New York Times sports columnist, remembering Whitey Ford and Don Larsen here on Caught Listening. Sir, we appreciate the time as always. I love talking with you. It's a lot of fun, and I certainly look forward to our next chat and next discussion.
You can count on me as one of the crowd, one of the guys.
Really appreciate it, sir. Thanks so much.
Thanks, man.
All right, George Vescey, the New York Times. I can't disagree with him. Again, I grew up rooting against the Yankees for so long, and all due respect to Mr. Baseball, Donnie Mattingly, I think the next great Yankee, is Mo Rivera. Greatest at his position of all time, and obviously a member of one of the most dominant teams in sports history. Appreciate his time. I appreciate your time in listening to another chapter of our In Memoriam series here in 2020. We've got plenty, unfortunately, a number of other legends to discuss, to talk about, and we look forward to doing that and remembering the lives and the legacies of these legends of the game. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, review wherever you get your podcasts, Google and Apple Play, and of course, Amazon Podcasts, as well as publichousemedia.org. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Just search Caught Listening by Public House Media, or email the show, caughtlisteningphm@gmail.com. I'm Christian Heimel. You can find me on Twitter, @Chris Heimel. And until next week, you have been caught listening.